It began as a morning like any other, a Sunday bathed in soft light, where the church bells of St. Luke's rang through the small town with their familiar melody. Families dressed in their best attire, children skipped along the cobblestone streets, and the promise of a peaceful Sabbath hung in the air. Parents kissed their little ones goodbye, watching them join the lively stream of children making their way toward the white stone chapel at the center of town. 50 children in total crossed the threshold of St. Luke's that morning, their laughter echoing off the stained glass windows, their voices carrying the innocence of youth. It was a scene that spoke of trust, tradition, and safety. None could have imagined it would become the last time those children were ever seen alive. The town had long placed its faith in St. Luke's. The church had stood for centuries, its foundations sunk deep into the earth, its spire piercing the sky like a sentinel of heaven itself. Generations had prayed within its walls, baptisms and weddings had been celebrated beneath its vaulted ceilings, and funerals had been mourned with hymns of hope. The townspeople trusted it with their souls, and more importantly, with their children. Yet beneath its surface, hidden in shadows no one dared question. Something darker had been festering. When the bells rang at noon and Sunday school was meant to be dismissed, parents stood waiting on the steps, smiling as they expected to see their sons and daughters run out with the excitement of lessons freshly learned. But the doors never opened. Minutes turned to hours, and confusion turned to panic. Fathers banged on the doors, mothers cried out their children's names, and neighbors ran through the streets in search of the little ones. But the church remained silent, its great wooden doors locked from the inside. By evening, a crowd had gathered, torches and lanterns flickering as desperation grew. Finally, the doors were forced open. The classrooms lay empty, tiny chairs scattered as though abandoned in haste. Books lay on the floor, chalk marks half finished on the blackboards. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows or splintered locks. It was as though the 50 children had been erased from existence. The discovery of the empty church marked the beginning of a nightmare that would tear the community apart. Mothers collapsed on the cold stone floor, clutching dolls and coats left behind. Fathers shouted in fury, demanding answers that no one could give. The sheriff searched every inch of the building, from the choir loft to the bell tower, yet not a single trace of the children could be found. Only in the basement did he pause, disturbed by the faint smell of smoke and melted wax, and the strange marks that seemed to have been carved into the stone walls. Symbols no one recognized, patterns that seemed to twist and writhe in the flickering light of the lantern. Whispers began to circulate, whispers that grew into accusations. Some said the children had been taken by strangers who had been seen near the edge of town days earlier. Others muttered of an ancient curse, a dark force tied to the land long before the church was built. But soon, suspicion turned to the man who had been closest to the children that morning, Father Matthias, the priest of St. Luke's. Father Matthias had always been a figure of both reverence and unease. He spoke with fire in his sermons, often drifting into passages about sacrifice, purity, and eternal light. His eyes seemed to linger too long on the children, and though most dismissed it as harmless eccentricity, unease had lingered in the hearts of some. Now, with 50 children vanished under his watch, his strange words and habits took on a sinister new meaning. The priest insisted he knew nothing, that the children had been taken into God's greater plan. His words chilled the parents to the bone, for they did not sound like the comfort of a shepherd, but the cryptic ramblings of a man who had lost his tether to reason. Or worse, given himself to something unspeakable. As the days turned into nights filled with grief and anger, the search extended beyond the town. Woods were combed, rivers dragged, neighboring villages questioned, but no bodies, no footprints, no evidence of escape or abduction was ever found. It was as though the children had been swallowed by the earth itself, and perhaps, in some dreadful way, they had. Rumors spread of catacombs beneath the church, ancient tunnels said to predate St. Luke's, built by monks who worshipped not God, but something far older and far darker. Few had ever seen these passages, and fewer still returned when they tried. But when investigators finally uncovered a sealed stone door beneath the altar, their fears turned to horror. For behind it lay chambers blackened by centuries, walls etched with symbols like those found in the basement, and relics that spoke not of salvation but of rituals. The truth that would unfold in the coming weeks was unlike anything the town, or the world, had ever seen. The story of the 50 children of St. Luke's would echo across generations, not simply as a tale of disappearance, but as a reminder of how quickly faith could twist into fanaticism, how innocence could be devoured by darkness, and how a single church could become the stage for the most evil crime in religious history. The first light of dawn touched the cobblestone streets of the small town, painting the roofs in shades of gold and amber. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, mingling with the crisp morning air. The Sabbath had always been a day of ritual, a day when the world seemed to pause, and on that particular morning it carried with it an air of peace that seemed unshakable. Mothers straightened collars and smoothed dresses, fathers polished boots and guided little hands, and children laughed and tugged free from their parents' grasp, eager to join their friends at St. Luke's for Sunday school. The church bells began to ring, their melody drifting over the town, calling the faithful. It was a sound everyone trusted, one that bound the community together as tightly as family blood. The spire of St. Luke's towered above the town like a guardian, its white stone walls glowing in the morning sun. To the children, it was not just a church, but a place of wonder, filled with stained glass that turned sunlight into rainbows, with wooden pews that creaked like old friends, and with classrooms where stories of saints and miracles lit their imaginations on fire. They came in groups, siblings and cousins, neighbors and friends, their chatter filling the streets. Some carried little prayer books, others clutched dolls or wooden toys they refused to leave behind. To see them was to see innocence in its purest form, bows in hair, scuffed shoes, shy smiles, and the kind of laughter that made the heart lighter. Parents lingered at the church steps for a while, watching as the children disappeared inside. There were 50 of them in all, though no one counted at the time. No one thought to, for who would imagine a number like that would one day be carved into the town's history like a scar? Inside, Father Matthias greeted the children with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He was a tall man, his frame gaunt beneath his cassock, his voice deep and commanding. To the parents, he was a shepherd, a guide to their children's souls. To the children, he was sometimes frightening, though they could not explain why. His sermons had a way of straying into topics they did not understand: sacrifice, purity, eternal light, and his gaze often lingered too long on the youngest among them. Still, he was the priest, and priests were trusted without question. As the parents returned home, the town seemed to exhale in unison. Fathers sat down with newspapers, mothers prepared Sunday meals, and the streets grew quiet except for the faint echo of hymns carried from the church. The hours passed in calm rhythm, broken only by the occasional toll of the bells marking time. Nothing seemed amiss. Nothing hinted at the storm gathering beneath the surface of that peaceful morning. Inside the classrooms, lessons began as they always did. The older children read from scripture, their voices stumbling over Latin phrases they could barely pronounce. The younger ones colored pictures of saints, dipping brushes into jars of ink and paint. Some whispered jokes to each other when they thought no one was looking, while others listened wide-eyed to the stories of miracles and angels. Father Matthias walked between the rooms, pausing here and there to correct a child's words or place a heavy hand on a small shoulder. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over them as though he were counting, not their mistakes, but their very souls. Beneath the surface of ordinary routine, there was a strange stillness. One of the nuns assisting with the lessons, Sister Agnes, later described how the air seemed heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The candles flickered strangely, though there was no draft. The children, restless as they usually were, seemed oddly subdued as the morning stretched on. A few whispered to one another that the church basement smelled strange, like smoke and melted wax, though no one dared say it aloud to Father Matthias. At noon, the bells rang again. Parents rose from their tables, wiping flour from their hands, setting aside tools, and making their way toward the church. It was a familiar rhythm, a comforting pattern. They gathered in small groups at the steps, smiling, chatting, and waiting for the great wooden doors to open and release the tide of children running to their mothers and fathers. But as the minutes ticked by, the smiles began to fade. The doors did not open. Parents exchanged puzzled glances at first. Perhaps the lesson had run long. Perhaps Father Matthias had chosen to keep them in prayer. But as the minutes stretched into half an hour, unease began to creep in. Fathers rapped on the heavy oak doors, calling out. Mothers pressed their ears against the wood, straining to hear the laughter of their children inside. There was nothing. No voices, no footsteps, only silence. The sun crept higher and the once peaceful town found itself gathered in growing numbers before St. Luke's. Fear spread like wildfire. Some fathers began to pound harder, shouting their children's names. Mothers cried, their voices breaking, clutching shawls to their faces as dread took root. The sheriff was called, his key ring jangling as he tried the locks, but even he found the doors barred from within. By the time the doors were forced open with crowbars and axes, panic had replaced all reason. Parents surged inside, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors. The classrooms lay as if abandoned mid-breath. Small chairs sat in crooked rows, books lay open on desks, chalk still marked half, finished lessons on the boards. Coats hung neatly on pegs, dolls and toys lay scattered on the floor. It looked as though the children had simply vanished, dissolved into thin air. But what froze the blood of every soul present was not just the emptiness. It was the silence. A silence that was not natural, but oppressive, almost alive. The church that had always been filled with song and prayer now stood like a hollow shell, echoing only with the ragged sobs of parents. And somewhere in that silence, Father Matthias emerged from the shadows of the nave. His face was calm, his eyes strangely alight, as though he had been waiting for this moment. When mothers rushed him, screaming for their children, he merely raised his hands and said in a voice that chilled them all, "They have been taken into God's greater plan." The words struck like a blade, not offering comfort but sinking deep with dread. The children were gone. 50 in total vanished from the heart of the church on a morning that began in peace. And for the town, it was the beginning of a horror that would never leave them. The first hours after the discovery were a blur of panic and disbelief. Parents searched every corner of the church with trembling hands, flinging open doors, pulling aside curtains and calling the names of their children until their throats were raw. The classrooms, once so full of life, stood cold and empty. The choir stalls echoed with nothing but the sound of desperate footsteps. The vestry, where vestments and chalices were kept, yielded no trace. Even the crypt beneath the church, its stone steps slick with damp, revealed nothing but dust and cobwebs. It was as if the children had been plucked from existence. 50 souls, gone without a cry, without a struggle. The sheriff barked orders, though his own voice shook. "Search every inch of this place!" Men tore open closets and cabinets, some falling to their knees to check under pews as if the children might be hiding in some cruel game of hide and seek. Mothers wept uncontrollably, their sobs echoing against the high arches of the nave. Others clung to each other, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. Still others shouted accusations, pointing to Father Matthias, who stood motionless near the altar as though carved from stone. "Where are they?" One father screamed, his face red with rage. "What have you done?" The priest's eyes did not waver. "They are with the Lord," he said quietly, his voice calm in a way that made the blood of every listener run cold. His words, instead of offering solace, ignited fury. He was seized, shaken violently, his cassock tearing at the shoulders as fists struck his face. Yet even as blows landed, Father Matthias did not cry out. He only repeated, "They are with the Lord." By afternoon, the church had become a place of madness. The sheriff ordered men to search the town, thinking perhaps the children had been led away, that somehow they had slipped unseen through the streets. Doors were thrown open, barns scoured, wells inspected. Attics and cellars ransacked. Farmers abandoned their fields, merchants their shops, all joining the desperate search. But the children were nowhere. Not a footprint, not a scrap of cloth, not a single clue betrayed where they had gone. Night fell heavy and merciless. Lanterns burned across the town as men combed the woods beyond the fields, calling until their voices cracked. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to the ground with scraps of the children's clothing, but they whined and turned in circles, unable to catch a trail. The mothers huddled together in silence, their faces pale and hollow, as if the life had been drained from them in a single day. Fathers sat with their heads in their hands, staring blankly into the darkness, unable to speak. But the church, St. Luke's, stood at the heart of the storm. Its walls seemed to hold the weight of something unspeakable. Candles flickered in the windows, casting long shadows that seemed almost to move with intent. Some whispered that they heard faint cries when the wind passed through its bell tower, though none could say for certain if it was real or only their grief-conjuring ghosts. In the sheriff's office, Father Matthias sat bound to a chair, his face swollen from the beating he had endured. He had not resisted when they dragged him there. He had not spoken beyond his single refrain. "They are with the Lord." When pressed, when threatened with death, when the sheriff himself raised a pistol to his temple, Matthias only smiled faintly and whispered, "You cannot bring back what has been offered." The words chilled the sheriff more than the barrel of his own gun. He lowered the weapon and turned away, cursing under his breath. What did he mean, offered? By the second day, the town was unraveling. Sleep was scarce. The church bells tolled for prayer, but few attended, for no one could bear to step inside those walls again. Some believed the devil had walked among them. Others whispered of sacrifice, of ancient rites masked by the guise of religion. The whispers grew louder, and with them, suspicion turned to terror. A few brave souls returned to the church to search once more. They scoured the crypt, hammering at the stone floor in case hidden chambers lay beneath. They pried open the organ pipes, thinking the children might somehow have been concealed within. They even drained the baptismal font, though the water revealed nothing but its cold, empty basin. Yet there was a feeling. Every man who entered spoke of it, a heaviness in the air, a darkness that seemed to cling to the skin. And then came the discovery. On the third day, a group of men searching the woods stumbled upon a clearing where the grass had been scorched black, as though by fire. At its center lay a crude circle of stones, arranged not by nature but by deliberate hand. Upon the stones were the remains of candles, their wax melted into the earth. There was no sign of the children, no bones, no belongings, but something in the sight of that circle made even the bravest recoil. One man swore he heard faint singing when he stepped inside it. A choir of young voices carried on the wind. He fell to his knees in terror, clutching his ears, refusing to go closer. The clearing became the focus of frantic speculation. Some said it was evidence of a ritual, a place where Father Matthias or his accomplices had performed some unspeakable act. Others insisted it was the devil himself, claiming the children for his own. The sheriff tried to keep order, but his commands rang hollow. Fear was stronger than reason. Meanwhile, in his cell, Father Matthias seemed to know. He asked no questions of his captors, made no requests for food or water. Instead, he hummed hymns in the darkness, his voice low and tuneless, the words distorted as though twisted into something unholy. One guard swore he saw him smiling at nothing, as if listening to voices only he could hear. By the end of the week, the truth settled in like a sickness. The children were gone. No search party, no prayer, no plea had brought them back. The town moved as though in a daze, its laughter silenced, its joy stripped away. Families left food untouched at dinner tables, beds sat cold and undisturbed. Toys lay abandoned in yards, their owners lost to the void. The people of the town could not bear to speak of it, yet neither could they escape it. The number haunted them, 50. 50 children who walked into a church on a quiet Sunday morning and were never seen again. 50 souls who had been, in the words of the priest, offered. And in the shadows of the town's grief, Father Matthias waited, his hollow eyes gleaming with a knowledge he would never share, as if he alone understood the terrible fate of the vanished children. The clearing in the woods, discovered by frightened searchers, quickly became the locus of terror and speculation. By dawn of the next day, nearly the entire town had gathered there, standing on the edge of the blackened circle, afraid to step too close. The earth still smelled faintly of smoke, though no fire had touched the surrounding trees. The grass within the circle was crisp, charred in strange patterns that seemed almost like writing when viewed from a distance. The stones, though ordinary in appearance, bore streaks of soot as if they had been arranged for some ceremony long before the children vanished. The sheriff arrived with his deputies, trying to keep the crowd back, but the people pressed forward. Mothers clutched rosaries so tightly the beads cut into their palms. Fathers crossed themselves and whispered prayers through clenched teeth. Some men argued angrily that the site should be destroyed, the stones scattered, the earth salted. Others warned that disturbing it might provoke whatever power had taken their children. Fear made cowards of them all, yet also bound them together in silent awe. Old Mrs. Keating, who was known for her strange stories and half-mad ramblings, pushed her way to the front. Her eyes gleamed wild in the morning light. She raised a bony finger toward the circle and croaked, It is a mark, a covenant. This has been here longer than any of you, longer than this town. The ground remembers what was promised. Her words sent a ripple through the crowd. Some jeered at her, calling her insane, but others looked away uneasily, as if her words had spoken aloud the very dread they dared not admit. The sheriff knelt within the circle, ignoring the nervous mutterings around him. He examined the stones, running his hands along the scorched earth. Something about the place unnerved him deeply. It was not just a burned patch of land. It felt deliberate. Too deliberate. His deputy found the melted remains of candles, their wax hardened into the soil, and a crude wooden cross half buried in ash. The sheriff pocketed the cross, its wood strangely warm to the touch despite the cool morning air. By evening, news of the discovery reached Father Matthias in his cell. When the sheriff confronted him with the wooden cross, the priest's lips curved into the faintest smile. "You found the altar," he whispered. His voice was calm, almost tender, as if he were speaking of something sacred. "What happened here?" the sheriff demanded, slamming the cross onto the table. "What did you do with those children?" Matthias lifted his swollen eyes, dark hollows beneath them, and replied with words that froze the sheriff where he stood. "I did nothing. The offering was accepted." When pressed further, the priest refused to elaborate. He sat back, closed his eyes, and began to hum again, that same strange hymn that twisted familiar church melodies into something grotesque. The sheriff stormed out of the cell, but the priest's low voice followed him down the corridor, like the echo of a chant that did not belong to this world. Back in the town, whispers turned to hysteria. Some swore they had seen figures moving in the woods near the circle, tall shadows gliding between the trees. Others claimed to hear the laughter of children in the dead of night, carried on the wind, faint and mocking. A farmer stumbled home one evening babbling that he had found tiny handprints scorched into the bark of an oak tree, too small to belong to any adult, and too strange to dismiss. The town's pastor, Father Dunn, insisted that the people come together for prayer. But when they gathered in the church that night, they could barely force themselves to sit in the pews. The walls seemed to close in, the stained glass windows twisting the candlelight into shapes that made their hearts pound with unease. When the pastor spoke of faith and hope, his words rang hollow against the memory of Father Matthias's calm assurance. "They are with the Lord." Many fled the service early, preferring the safety of their homes to the suffocating silence of the sanctuary. And still, the circle lingered in their minds. It became a wound in the landscape, a place none dared to approach after dark. Children had been warned never to stray near it, though there were no children left in town to heed such warnings. By the end of the week, the grass beyond the clearing had begun to wither as well, as though the corruption of the circle was spreading outward, slow and inevitable. A council was called in the town hall. Voices rose, some demanding that the circle be burned and buried, others insisting it should remain untouched. A few argued it must be sanctified by holy water, though no one could say for certain whether such rites would banish what had rooted itself there. The sheriff, wary and hollow-eyed, listened to them all, but offered no answers. At the height of the debate, the doors burst open and one of the searchers stumbled in. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he held up an object for all to see. It was a child's shoe, charred black at the edges, the leather cracked and brittle. He swore he had found it at the circle, lying atop one of the stones, though he had not seen it there the day before. The mothers screamed, some fainted, and the meeting dissolved into chaos. The sheriff took the shoe in his hands, staring at it with a dread he could not put into words. He knew then that the circle was not simply a marker of what had been done, but a doorway to what was still unfolding. Something was feeding on the town's fear, on its grief, on the offering of innocent lives. And whatever it was not finished. That night, as a storm gathered over the horizon, lightning flashing in jagged streaks, a few townsmen swore they saw firelight burning again in the woods. They swore the circle glowed faintly, as though alive, and that dark shapes moved around it in silent procession. No one dared to follow, no one dared to draw closer. They locked their doors, pulled their shutters tight, and prayed that whatever haunted St. Luke's would not claim them next. But prayer, it seemed, had long since abandoned them. The storm that had threatened on the horizon finally broke the following morning. Rain lashed against the windows of the sheriff's office. the streets outside turning to rivers of mud. The town huddled indoors, shutters barred, as though the storm itself was another punishment for their sins. In the dim light of his cell, Father Matthias sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, as calm and composed as if he were in prayer. The storm did not trouble him. In fact, he seemed almost to savor it, his lips moving silently in rhythm with the thunder. The sheriff, exhausted from sleepless nights and relentless accusations from grieving parents, could bear the priest's serenity no longer. He entered the cell, dragging a chair with him, and sat opposite Matthias. He placed the child's burned shoe on the table between them, its charred leather filling the air with the faint smell of smoke. "Tell me," the sheriff growled, "what this means. What happened at that circle? You know more than you've said." Matthias's eyes drifted to the shoe. For the first time, his smile faltered, though only slightly. "The covenant holds," he murmured. "The signs are clear. They were taken as they always were meant to be." "Taken by who?" The sheriff snapped. His fist slammed onto the table. "God does not steal children from their families! Tell me the truth!" Matthias tilted his head, his gaze sharpening. "Do you think this is new? Do you think this town has not always belonged to him?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Before the church, before the town, before even your law, there was an agreement. The land was marked. It must be fed, or it will devour everything. The children were not lost. They were offered." The sheriff recoiled, his jaw tightening. "Offered by who?" "By you." The priest chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Not I alone. Not I first. Generations before me, men of the cloth, sworn to God, gave what was required. Some struggled, yes. Some wept. But they all obeyed. That circle of stones is older than any of us, older than this town. I only did what I was meant to do." The sheriff's blood ran cold. His grip tightened on the table until his knuckles went white. 50 children, Father! 50! You expect me to believe this was the will of God." Matthias's smile returned, serene and terrifying. "Not God, Sheriff. Something older. Something that your scriptures cannot name. But he has always been here, beneath the earth, beneath the stones. The covenant ensures our survival. Without it, the land itself would wither, and all of us would be taken in their place. Do you not see? Their sacrifice protects you." The sheriff rose to his feet, trembling with fury and horror. "You're mad," he spat. "You'll hang for this?" But Matthias did not flinch. His eyes gleamed with a terrible conviction. "You can kill me, but the covenant will not die. Another will take my place. And when he wakes fully, no rope, no gallows, no law will matter." The sheriff stormed out of the cell, but the words clung to him like a sickness. He tried to dismiss them, tried to assure himself it was the rambling of a lunatic. Yet the burned shoe in his pocket weighed heavily, and the memory of that scorched circle gnawed at his soul. He could not shake the feeling that Matthias was not lying, not entirely. That night, unable to rest, the sheriff pored over old town records by lamplight. He searched baptismal registries, burial lists, and faded ledgers from the founding of the parish. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but as he traced the years, a chilling pattern emerged. Every few decades, without explanation, there were mass gaps in the records of children. Whole groups missing from the books. Some noted as relocated, others left blank altogether. Always 50. 50 names erased, 50 souls vanished. His hands trembled as he turned page after page. The dates lined up perfectly, each disappearance separated by roughly half a century. His stomach turned as he realized the horrifying truth. The covenant Matthias spoke of was not a delusion. It had been happening for generations. As the storm raged outside, the sheriff felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon him. He slammed the ledger shut and buried his face in his hands. If the cycle was real, then this town had lived under a shadow for longer than anyone alive could remember. And now, the shadow had claimed its due once again. The next morning, he gathered the council, determined to reveal what he had discovered. The men and women of the town sat in the hall, pale and weary, their eyes bloodshot from nights of weeping. When the sheriff laid out the evidence, the missing records, the repeating cycle, the room erupted in chaos. Some denied it, insisting the ledgers were wrong or that the priest had tampered with them. Others broke down, sobbing that their children were victims of a pact older than their faith. At the center of the uproar, Mrs. Keating rose again. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "I told you," she hissed. "This is the land's hunger. It always has been. The stones mark the mouth, and he beneath will never sleep forever. The council fell into stunned silence. No one spoke. Outside, the storm continued, relentless, as though the heavens themselves bore witness to their horror. The sheriff, pale and hollow, left the hall knowing there was no comfort to offer. His town was built on blood, and the truth could no longer be hidden. Father Matthias had confessed, and the confession was not of a single crime but of a history soaked in darkness. That night, in his cell, the priest sang again. His voice rose over the storm, clear and haunting, carrying words no one could understand. The guards swore the hymn seemed to come not just from Matthias's lips, but from the very stones of the building itself. They shuddered as they listened, whispering prayers under their breath, but none dared to silence him. For in his song there was power, ancient, dreadful power, and the certainty that the covenant was far from over. The storm subsided, but the quiet it left behind was more dreadful than thunder. The town was blanketed in damp mist that clung to every corner, as though the very air sought to hide what had been revealed. The streets lay empty after dark. Families barred their doors and whispered prayers. Yet those prayers felt thin against the heavy silence pressing in from the woods. It was on the third night after Father Matthias's confession that the first whispers began. Mrs. Halpern, who lived near the churchyard, awoke to the sound of children laughing outside her window. Her heart lifted, foolishly hoping it was her own lost boy returned. She rushed barefoot to the door, but when she stepped into the yard, there was nothing, only the sound of the breeze through the trees. Yet the laughter had been real, soft and bright, as though carried from another world. She collapsed to her knees in the mud, weeping, convinced she had lost her mind. By the next morning, others reported the same. Fathers and mothers claimed to hear footsteps in their hallways, light and quick, like the patter of small feet. Some swore they saw shadows dart past doorways, the shapes of children vanishing the moment they turned to look. The townspeople whispered among themselves that the missing little ones were not truly gone, that their spirits lingered, bound to the covenant. The sheriff dismissed the stories as grief and imagination, but even he began to falter when he heard them for himself. Alone in his office, surrounded by damp ledgers and the stench of mildew, he heard a faint tapping at the window. When he turned, he swore he saw a small handprint pressed against the glass. Pale as ash, before it faded away, he sat frozen in his chair until dawn, unable to breathe, unable to pray. As the whispers spread, so too did fear. No house was untouched. The Miller family swore their daughter's doll spoke in the night, repeating the words, "He is hungry." The O'Connell boy claimed he woke to see his missing sister standing at the foot of his bed, her eyes hollow sockets, dripping with black tears. Some neighbors thought he lied, but when his screams tore through the night, the whole street heard him. By morning, he could not speak at all. The council gathered again, desperation etched into every face. Voices rose in panic. "The priest has cursed us!" some shouted. "Burn him, burn the circle. End it all." Others pleaded that to defy the covenant would doom them all. The sheriff stood silent, torn between law and horror, between reason and the undeniable dread gnawing at him. That night, the whispers deepened. They were no longer faint echoes, but clear voices calling names, children calling for their mothers, their fathers, their brothers and sisters. Windows rattled with unseen hands. Doors creaked open in the dark. The whole town seemed alive with the presence of the lost. In the convent, where the air was colder than anywhere else, Father Dunn led a vigil. Candles flickered as the congregation gathered, voices trembling through hymns. But midway through the prayers, a sound rose above them, a chorus of children's voices singing from the rafters. The hymn faltered, mothers wailed, and one candle after another sputtered out until the church lay in darkness. When the lights were relit, several of the women swore they saw little faces peering down from the gallery, faces pale and twisted in sorrow. Father Dunn fainted at the altar. The sheriff confronted Matthias again, slamming the cell door with a force that rattled the walls. "They're here," he growled. "The children. Their voices haunt the whole town. What have you done?" Matthias only smiled, calm as ever. "I told you," he said softly. "The offering was accepted. They are not gone. They serve now. They call because he stirs. Who is he?" the sheriff demanded, gripping the bars with white knuckles. "What name does he bear?" The priest leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with feverish devotion. "Names are for men, sheriff. He is older than your tongue, older than your world. He is hunger made flesh. He sleeps beneath the stones, and the children's voices are his breath in the night. The sheriff staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to dismiss it, to cling to reason, but the voices were real. The whole town had heard them. That night, the whispers grew bolder still. They did not only call, they beckoned. Doors swung open by themselves, leading into the mist outside. Lamps flickered out, leaving families in pitch black while laughter echoed through their homes. The Weaver family awoke to find muddy footprints across their floorboards, tiny footprints that led from the door to their children's empty beds. Their boys were never seen again. Panic consumed the town. Some families packed what they could and fled, but most stayed, too afraid to step beyond the boundaries of the village. What if the shadows in the woods devoured them whole? What if the Covenant's hunger followed them wherever they went? Better, they thought, to cower together, even as the voices grew louder. By the end of the week, no one slept. Mothers held candles by their bedsides, fathers sat awake with rifles across their knees. Though bullets would not help against what prowled in the night, the whispers became a constant murmur, filling every room, every alley, every dream. It was no longer grief or imagination, it was invasion. The children had become the town's shadows, their laughter and cries a reminder of the pact that could not be broken. And through it all, Father Matthias sang in his cell. His hymn wove itself into the whispers, mingling with the voices of the lost. Guards wept, begging the sheriff to silence him, but the sheriff knew it would change nothing. The priest was no longer merely a man. He was a vessel, a herald. And with every note he sang, the town sank deeper into a darkness that had no end. By the time the second week had passed, the whispers no longer frightened the town. They had hollowed it out. People walked like ghosts through the muddy streets, eyes red from sleepless nights, lips trembling with prayers that had long since lost their power. The children's voices never ceased. They came in the dead of night, in the break of morning, even at midday when the sun should have banished all shadows. The laughter, the crying, the soft calls of Mama and Papa were constant, echoing from the woods, through chimneys, down wells. The town was a cage of sound, and no one could escape. Then came the first sighting of the procession. It was old Mr. Latham who saw it, returning late from tending his cows. As he passed near the edge of the forest, he noticed lanterns bobbing among the trees. Thinking it was a search party, his heart lifted. Perhaps some of the missing children had been found. But as he crept closer, he realized the lanterns were not carried by men. They floated, swaying gently in the night air, casting pale, sickly light that barely touched the ground. Beneath them walked figures, small, stooped, their heads bent low. At first he thought they were children, but their movements were wrong, too slow, too deliberate, as though dragged forward by unseen strings. Mr. Latham swore he saw one lift its face. It was a child's face, yes, but the eyes were black pits, and the mouth opened wider than any human mouth should. A silent scream stretching across the pale skin. The old man stumbled back, crossed himself, and fled to town. He burst into the tavern, raving about the black procession. No one wanted to believe him, but his terror was too raw, his words too vivid. Soon others claimed to see the same, glowing lights weaving through the trees at night, always moving toward the circle of stones. The sheriff ordered patrols, though the men he summoned were reluctant. They went armed with rifles, their courage brittle as glass. On the third night they saw it too. A line of figures walking slowly, silently, their shadows long and thin in the lantern light. The men raised their rifles, but when one fired, the sound cracked through the woods and the procession vanished instantly. No smoke, no scatter, no blood. Only silence, thicker and heavier than before. When they returned to town, one deputy's hair had turned white at the temples. He resigned his post the next morning. Word spread quickly. Soon the whole town knew. The children had not merely disappeared, they marched. They returned, not as themselves, but as part of something darker, something ancient. The black procession became a nightly terror. Families huddled in their homes, listening for the sound of shuffling feet, daring not to look outside lest they see a familiar face among the pale, hollow-eyed figures. The sheriff tried once more to confront Father Matthias. "Tell me what they are," he demanded. "Are they alive? Are they dead?" The priest's smile was faint, but steady. "They are neither. They are his messengers now, his heralds. Every step they take wears the world thinner, like parchment burning at the edges. When the circle breaks, he will come through. The sheriff slammed his fists against the bars. How do we stop it? Matthias tilted his head, his expression almost kind. You cannot. You can only choose whether to embrace it or perish fighting it. The covenant is older than your laws, older than your fears. It will endure, with or without you. The words haunted the sheriff, but he refused to yield. That night, he gathered a handful of men and ventured to the circle of stones. The mist hung heavy, muffling every sound, but soon they heard it, the shuffling, the soft scrape of many feet moving together. Lanterns glowed faintly ahead, pale orbs of light bobbing in the darkness. The men froze as the procession came into view. There they were 50 figures, small and fragile, draped in shadows that clung to their limbs like chains. Their faces were visible in the dim light. Faces of the missing children, twisted by sorrow, their mouths moving in silent chants that none could understand. Some of the men sobbed openly, recognizing their sons, their daughters. One father dropped his rifle and stumbled forward, crying out his child's name. The sheriff tried to pull him back, but it was too late. The man entered the circle. The child he reached for lifted its head, eyes black as void, and touched his face with a pale hand. For a moment he smiled, believing his daughter had returned to him. Then his scream tore through the woods. The lanterns flickered, the shadows surged, and in an instant he was gone. Swallowed into the line of figures, his place taken, his body shuffling forward in perfect step. The men fled, dragging the sheriff with them. None looked back until they reached the safety of town. But the memory of that scream would never leave them. The next day, the sheriff announced a ban. No one was to go near the woods at night. No one was to approach the circle under any circumstances. But the town was already unraveling. Mothers begged to join the procession willingly, desperate to be reunited with their children. Fathers locked themselves in their homes, guarding what little family remained. The church was abandoned. Its prayers had proven useless. The whispers continued, louder than ever, now mingling with the sound of footsteps outside every door. The people knew the black procession was not confined to the woods anymore. It wandered the very streets of the town, searching, claiming. And always, the line grew longer. The first cracks appeared quietly, so subtly that few noticed at first. It was only the children's shoes, tiny black scuffs that began to appear on the roads at dawn, leading from the town square toward the woods. The footprints were too small to belong to the living townsfolk and too fresh to be relics of the missing. They came every morning, more and more of them, until the dirt paths looked worn down by countless invisible feet. But the greatest change was at the circle of stones itself. What had always been a silent place, thick with mist, now seemed to pulse with a faint hum, like the sound of bees buried deep in the earth. The stones, once cold and gray, glowed faintly at night, their surfaces slick with condensation that smelled of iron. And then came the fissure, thin at first, running through the earth at the center of the circle. By the third day, it had widened into a crack deep enough that no lantern light could penetrate it. From that black wound in the earth came a stench like rotting flowers and whispers that made even the bravest men clutch at their ears. The sheriff was the first to see it with his own eyes. He had returned with 2 deputies, determined to understand what was happening. When they approached, they saw the procession gathering, 50 children's figures standing in perfect silence around the stones. Their lanterns floated in the mist, casting elongated shadows across the fissure. The sheriff swore he saw the ground shift, as if something beneath was pushing against the soil, eager to rise. One of the deputies muttered, "This isn't just hauntings anymore. This is birth." The sheriff silenced him with a glare, though the words struck a chord of truth. That same night, the townspeople heard it too. The ground shook faintly, like a giant beast stirring in its sleep. Windows rattled, and water spilled from cups. In the church, candles flared and then snuffed themselves out, leaving the pews in total darkness. The people were terrified, but Father Matthias, still locked in his cell, was serene. When questioned, he whispered, "The circle was never meant to last forever. It is a seal, not a sanctuary. And seals break." The following day, the sheriff called a gathering. The square was crowded with pale, wary faces. He spoke plainly. "The children we lost, they are not gone. They march in something we don't understand. There's a power beneath us, something bound by the stones. It grows stronger, and if that seal breaks, none of us will survive. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some wanted to flee the town, but others argued it would make no difference. The shadows followed them already, whispering at their windows, scratching at their doors. There was no escape. Then, a mother named Clara raised her voice. Her boy, Thomas, had been among the missing. She swore she had seen him standing at the edge of her farm the night before, his pale face staring through her window. He had lifted a hand, almost waving, almost beckoning. He looked at me, she cried. He looked at me like he wanted me to help him! We can't just run. We have to bring them back. Hope flickered in the crowd, desperate and fragile. Could the children be saved? Or were they only vessels now, puppets of the darkness beneath? The sheriff said nothing. In his heart, he already knew the truth. That evening, the fissure widened again. A sound came from below, low, guttural, like the moan of an organ dragged across stone. The mist thickened, spreading across the fields, blotting out the moon. And then the stones cracked. Not fully, but enough for fragments to fall away, leaving jagged wounds in the ancient pillars. From those cracks seeped shadows, curling like smoke, wrapping around the children's figures in the procession. The lanterns flickered, dimmed, then glowed brighter, as though feeding on something far worse than oil. The deputies wanted to fire into the circle, to destroy the stones or drive back the procession. But when one raised his rifle, the sheriff stopped him. Bullets won't stop what's under there. We'll only anger it. Instead, he ordered them back. He knew the town was running out of time, but he needed answers. Against his better judgment, he returned to the jail and unlocked Father Matthias's cell. You know what it is, the sheriff said, pointing a gun at the priest's chest. You'll tell me, or I swear I'll drag you to that fissure myself. Matthias laughed softly. You think I fear him? Sheriff, I have spent my whole life preparing for this moment. That circle was never meant to keep him out. It was meant to keep him in, until the appointed time. What is he? The sheriff demanded. The priest's eyes shone with feverish devotion. He is older than your Christ, older than your saints, older even than the stones themselves. The villagers before you knew him. They bound him with sacrifice, chained him beneath the earth, and prayed he would never stir. But hunger is eternal, and now he wakes. The sheriff pressed the barrel against Matthias's throat. How do we stop it? You don't, Matthias whispered. You either serve him, or you join the children. The sheriff locked him back in the cell, shaken. But even as he walked away, he knew Matthias had spoken the truth. There was no stopping what was to come. That night, the black procession marched again. This time, they were not 50. There were more, adults among them now, their faces pale, their mouths moving in silent chants. The father, who had been taken days before, shuffled among them, his eyes as black as his daughter's. The line grew longer, the lanterns brighter, the hum of the stones louder. And at the center, the fissure widened once more. The earth groaned, splitting further. For the first time, a clawed hand of pure shadow reached upward, clutching at the air, before sinking back into the crack. The seal was breaking. The covenant was failing. The town had only days left, perhaps only hours. The decision was madness, but despair makes madmen of us all. When the fissure yawned wider and the earth groaned like a dying beast, a group of townsfolk gathered at the sheriff's command. Torches were lit, ropes coiled, and trembling hands gripped lanterns. They were not warriors but bakers, farmers, mothers, and sons. Each face was pale, marked by sleepless nights and haunted eyes. Yet all carried the same thought: if they did not act now, they would all be swallowed by the darkness rising from below. The sheriff led them to the circle. The mist parted as if it knew their intent. 50 children stood around the stones, their hollow eyes fixed on the fissure. They did not move as the townsfolk approached, nor did they speak. Only their lanterns swayed gently, dripping with an oily black flame that hissed in the night. At the center, the fissure gaped like a wound in the earth. The sheriff tied the first rope around his waist, and 2 men secured it to a stone pillar. If I don't come back, he told them, you pull up the next. We need eyes below. We need to know what we're facing. No one argued. No one dared. The sheriff descended into the crack. The walls were damp, lined with roots that twisted like veins, some pulsing faintly as though carrying blood. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, carrying with it the smell of iron and something far fouler, like meat left to rot in the sun. The sounds of the procession above faded, replaced by a distant thrumming, as though the earth itself had a heartbeat. At the bottom, his lantern illuminated a vast cavern. The ground was slick with black moss, and the ceiling dripped with a tar-like substance that hissed when it struck the floor. In the center of the cavern was the stone coffin, massive and ancient, the chains that bound it glowing faintly red as though heated from within. Symbols carved into the rock flickered like firelight, though no flame touched them. The sheriff's breath caught in his throat. He had seen death before, too much of it, but nothing like this. This was not death. This was something older, something wrong. As the others descended one by one, the cavern filled with gasps and whispers. A mother crossed herself. A farmer fell to his knees, clutching his chest as if the air itself was poison. But no one dared turn back. Then the coffin shifted, only a fraction, only for a second, but it moved. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the chains rattled. A sound seeped from within, not a voice, not a growl, but a chorus of whispers so layered it became a roar. The townsfolk clutched their ears, crying out in agony. The sheriff staggered but forced himself forward. Etched into the ground around the coffin was a circle, carved deep into the stone floor. Within the circle were 50 names, names of children scratched by hand centuries ago. The sheriff bent low and read them, his stomach turning cold. They were the names of children from long before his time, long before even his grandfather's grandfather had walked the earth. They've been feeding it for centuries. He muttered, his voice trembling. 50 children every generation. That's the covenant. That's the price. The realization spread through the group like wildfire. The children had never simply vanished. They had been given, deliberately, ritually, generation after generation, to keep the creature bound. And now the seal was failing because the offering was incomplete, the chain of sacrifice broken. Above them, the ground shook violently. Dust poured into the cavern, and faint screams echoed down the fissure. The procession was no longer silent. The children's mouths were open, chanting in a language that grated like broken glass. Their voices carried into the cavern, feeding the chains with unholy power. The sheriff realized with dawning horror that the children were no longer victims. They were guardians of the seal, their souls twisted into eternal servitude. One of the men screamed and pointed at the coffin. The chains were snapping. One by one, the glowing links burst apart, releasing bursts of heat and smoke. From within, black tendrils slithered out, groping blindly, tasting the air. Where they touched the ground, the stone corroded and hissed. The sheriff raised his lantern high. "We need to get out!" he shouted, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew escape would mean abandoning the town. But Clara, the grieving mother, stepped forward. Her eyes were wide, her face streaked with tears. "No! My boy is in there. If we leave, he'll be lost forever. I can hear him." She pressed her hands against the coffin, ignoring the screams of the others. The coffin shuddered violently. A sound ripped through the cavern. A sound like bones breaking and wood splintering all at once. The sheriff grabbed Clara, trying to drag her back, but her hands were stuck. The black tendrils wrapped around her wrists, pulling her closer. Her scream echoed through the cavern, high and piercing, until it cut off suddenly as she was dragged against the stone lid. Her body went limp, and then she was gone, sucked inside, swallowed whole. The coffin glowed brighter. The fissure widened. Above them, the children's chanting grew deafening. The circle of stones cracked further, pieces falling into the fissure. The air thickened, pressing against their lungs, making every breath a labor. The sheriff knew then that this was no longer about saving the children. This was about survival. He shouted at the others to climb, to flee while they still could. Ropes strained as men and women scrambled upward, clawing at the walls. The sheriff stayed behind, his lantern casting long, shaking shadows across the coffin. For a brief moment, the whispers coalesced into words, a single phrase that tore through his skull, "Release me." He staggered back, his hands clutching his ears, his vision blurring. He saw the future in flashes, streets choked with fog, buildings crumbling, children's laughter twisted into screams. The thing inside the coffin was not meant for the earth, and yet it was coming. With the last of his strength, the sheriff climbed. The fissure rumbled. The chains snapped, and the coffin lid cracked down the center, splitting wide enough for a shadowy hand to claw upward. By the time he reached the surface, the town was chaos. The children no longer stood silently. They moved, their steps in unison, marching toward the fissure. Their lanterns blazed with unnatural light, illuminating faces twisted into grins too wide, too sharp. The sheriff collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. He looked back once at the fissure, where the coffin now glowed like a forge, the hand of the creature reaching ever higher. The descent had given them answers, but no hope. The circle had broken. The seal was failing. And something older than mankind was about to step into the world. The night had never seemed so alive. The fissure pulsed like a wound in the earth, light spilling from it in unholy colors that twisted and writhed against the darkness. The townsfolk, what remained of them, gathered at a distance. Some clutched crosses. Others held shotguns, though all knew bullets would mean nothing. Their faces were masks of terror, illuminated by the unnatural glow that stained the sky. At the center of the circle, the children marched, 50 little feet stepping in perfect unison, their lanterns blazing with black fire. Their mouths moved in silent rhythm, chanting words too low for the ear yet heavy in the soul. Each syllable made the fissure groan wider. Each breath seemed to stoke the thing clawing its way from the coffin below. The sheriff stumbled forward, his shirt torn, his face streaked with dirt and blood. His voice broke as he shouted to the crowd, "We can't let them finish! If they do, we're all dead!" But even as he spoke, he saw in their eyes that hope had withered. The ritual had begun long before any of them were born. They were nothing but witnesses to its end. The ground shook. A thunderous crack split the air as the last of the chains shattered. The coffin below split open completely, and a hand, black, charred, with claws like jagged glass, thrust upward, tearing into the air. The fissure belched smoke and ash. From deep within, something vast and unseen shifted, its movement so great the cavern walls groaned in protest. Children laughed. It was not a sweet laugh, nor innocent, but shrill, cruel, and alien. Their voices rose, forming a choir of madness. Mothers screamed and rushed forward, but the sheriff and others held them back. To step into that circle was to be consumed. Everyone knew it. The mist that had haunted the town for days now poured forth from the fissure in great waves, crawling over the ground, swallowing homes, barns, and streets. Where it touched, wood blackened, metal rusted, and livestock collapsed, their eyes wide with terror even in death. The world was decaying, second by second, in the shadow of the awakening. Then it came, the voice. Not in the air, but in their minds. A voice older than language, heavy as the mountains. At last, people fell to their knees, clutching their heads. Some screamed, some wept. A few laughed hysterically, their sanity cracking beneath the weight of it. The sheriff staggered, his vision swimming, his skull pounding like it would split open. The voice was everywhere. Above, below, inside. 50 generations have bound me. 50 offerings have kept me chained. But the seal is broken. The earth shall be unmade. From the fissure, a shape began to rise. No words could contain it. Its body seemed made of shadow and stone, yet alive with fire. Its form shifted with every glance. Sometimes a man, sometimes a beast, sometimes both and neither. Its eyes, twin abysses, gazed upon the town. Every heart froze. The sheriff forced himself to his feet, though his legs trembled. He raised his voice over the cries of the people. "This isn't over. We can fight it. Burn the fissure. Destroy the circle. Something." But the children turned their heads toward him as one. 50 pairs of hollow eyes fixed on him, and 50 mouths spoke in unison. "You cannot stop what has always been." They advanced, their lanterns swinging, flames hissing. The sheriff fired his revolver, shots echoing in the night. One child staggered, but no blood came. Instead, black smoke hissed from the wound, and the child stood again, walking without pause. Despair swept the crowd. People fled, scattering into the mist. But the mist followed, curling into every street and doorway, hunting them down. Screams echoed in the distance, cut short as the fog devoured them. The sheriff stayed, his eyes locked on the fissure. Somewhere in that chasm, below the rising horror, he thought of Clara, the mother who had been dragged into the coffin. He thought of her boy, of the countless others. And rage filled him, hot and bitter. He turned to the remaining townsfolk, those too paralyzed to flee. "We end this tonight," he said. His voice cracked, but there was iron in it. "If we run, it follows. If we hide, it finds us. The only way is to stop it here, burn it all, the circle, the church, everything." A silence followed, broken only by the growl of the earth and the shrieks of the children. Then, slowly, one by one, people nodded. Farmers clutched their lanterns like weapons. A blacksmith lifted his hammer. A mother tightened her grip on her rosary. Desperation gave them strength, the kind only the doomed possess. They moved together, charging the circle. Torches were hurled, flames licking across the dry grass. The sheriff struck at the stones, shattering one with a desperate blow. The children screamed in unison, their bodies convulsing, their flames sputtering. The creature roared, its voice shaking the ground, fury echoing through the air. The fissure widened further, the coffin now fully engulfed in fire and smoke. The beast clawed higher, its shoulders emerging, vast wings unfolding like storm clouds. The chains were gone, the seal broken. But the people fought on, tearing at the circle, breaking stones, burning every trace of the ritual. One by one they fell. The black tendrils lashed out, seizing men and women, dragging them screaming into the fissure. The children's lanterns exploded, spilling black fire that clung to skin, devouring flesh. But still they fought. Still they struck. The sheriff stood at the center, his revolver empty, his torch burning low. He stared at the creature, towering above, its shadow blotting out the moon. His voice was hoarse, his throat raw, but he shouted anyway, a defiance that echoed into the abyss. "You will not have us!" And with the last of his strength, he hurled his torch onto the coffin itself. The dry moss and ancient wood caught instantly, flames racing across its surface. For a moment, just a moment, the creature recoiled, its roar shattering the night. The children screamed, dropping their lanterns. The mist hissed and burned. Hope flickered, fragile, desperate but real. But as the sheriff watched, the flames guttered. The black fire of the children rose again, devouring the light, choking the blaze. The coffin cracked further, and the creature's face began to emerge. The awakening had begun, and no fire, no steel, no prayer seemed strong enough to stop it. The church bell tolled midnight, though no hand pulled its rope. Each clang echoed like a death knell across the burning town, trembling through the bones of those who remained alive. The streets of Satine. Luke's were no longer recognizable. Houses collapsed in heaps of charred timber, the air thick with smoke and sulfur. The mist had spread everywhere, swallowing every path of escape. The townsfolk who had fled screamed in the distance, their voices cut short as if choked by unseen hands. At the center of it all, the fissure had become a gaping maw. From it rose the towering shape of the thing the townspeople had only glimpsed before. Its wings unfolded like storms, blotting out the sky, and its head, crowned with jagged bone, lifted above the ruins. Its eyes were pits of shadow, swallowing the light of the fires. Wherever it looked, wood rotted, stone cracked, and men fell dead without a sound. The sheriff stood before it, ragged and broken, his revolver long discarded, his torch extinguished. Around him huddled the last survivors, no more than a dozen souls, their faces streaked with blood and ash. Among them were children too young to understand, and elders too wary to run. They looked to him not as a leader, but as the last voice of defiance in a world unraveling. The children of the town, the lost 50, still marched around the fissure. Their eyes glowed like coals, their mouths moving in silent unison. The black fire of their lanterns lit the night, feeding the beast as it clawed its way higher into the world. It was almost free now. Soon there would be no turning back. The sheriff dropped to his knees. His chest heaved, his lungs burned, and despair pressed against his heart like a weight. He had fought, they had all fought, but every strike, every prayer, every sacrifice had been swallowed by the abyss. And still the creature rose. A whisper cut through his hopelessness. It was not the beast's voice, nor the chanting of the children. It was faint, human. He turned his head and saw, lying in the dirt, the rosary Clara had given him before she was taken. Its beads were cracked, its cross blackened by flame, but it pulsed faintly, as if with a heartbeat of its own. The sheriff clutched it, his hand trembling. He had prayed before, prayed until his throat was raw, but never had he truly believed. Yet now, as the sky split with fire and shadow, belief seemed to be the only weapon left. He raised the rosary high. "If there is a God above," he rasped, his voice carrying across the square, "then hear us now. Not for me, not for the sinners, not for this cursed ground, but for the children, the innocent who were stolen. If there is mercy, if there is justice, let it fall tonight." The survivors fell with him, their knees in the dirt, their voices rising in broken prayer. Words tumbled over each other, pleas, sobs, fragments of psalms. It was not unity, not the organized ritual of the church, but the desperate cry of souls with nothing left but hope. The beast roared, its voice shaking the heavens. It stretched its wings wide, blotting out the burning sky. Its claws dug into the edges of the fissure, pulling its body higher, stone shattering beneath its weight. But as it did, the rosary in the sheriff's hand burned brighter. The cracked beads glowed like embers. The blackened cross shone white-hot, casting light into the mist. The children staggered. Their lanterns flickered. Their chant faltered for the first time. Some clutched their heads, shrieking in pain. The beast turned its gaze to the sheriff, its abyssal eyes narrowing. Shadows poured from its mouth, a tide of darkness that rushed to smother him. But the light did not falter. It spread, searing through the mist, burning it away. The fissure trembled, its edges collapsing inward as though resisting the beast's rise. Chains that had shattered reappeared, glowing white-hot, reforging themselves from light, winding around the coffin below. The sheriff screamed as the rosary burned his hand, the flesh blistering, but he did not let go. His voice cracked as he shouted the words again. "Mercy! Justice! For the children!" The ground split with a deafening crack. A column of light burst upward from the fissure, engulfing the beast. Its roar shook the town, shaking the bones of the earth itself. It thrashed, wings beating like hurricanes, claws tearing at the light. But the chains tightened, dragging it down, pulling it back into the coffin. Its body dissolved, its shadow unraveling like smoke. The children collapsed one by one, their lanterns shattering into dust. Their eyes cleared, no longer hollow, no longer glowing. Some wept. Some called out for their mothers. The spell was broken. The light consumed everything, the fissure, the coffin, the mist. For a moment, it was as though the world itself had been remade. Then, as suddenly as it came, the light vanished. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. The sheriff fell forward, the rosary slipping from his burned hand. The survivors rushed to him, calling his name, but his eyes were closed, his body still. His final prayer had drained him of everything, leaving nothing behind but peace on his face. The children gathered around, dazed but alive, clutching the hands of the survivors. They had returned, not as specters, not as hollow shells, but as children once more. The 50 who had vanished had come home, though scarred by the horrors they had endured. St. Luke's church stood blackened and broken, its bell tower shattered, its altar reduced to rubble. The town was in ruins, many lost forever to the mist. But the beast was gone. The covenant had been broken. The cycle had ended. For generations to come, the town would whisper of that night. Of the beast that had risen and the sheriff who had stopped it with nothing but a prayer and a broken rosary. Some doubted. Some believed. But none could deny the scars. The ruins, the burned earth, the haunted eyes of the 50 children who survived. And though the fissure had sealed, some nights the ground trembled still. Some nights in the distance, a faint laugh echoed on the wind. For evil that old is never truly gone. It only sleeps.